Hello and welcome to The World Today. I'm Eleanor. MH370 will lead to significant changes in aviation security well beyond Malaysia.
The industry has understood some of the safety and security challenges that it's faced, but this incident alone has highlighted a number that, although had been recognised, perhaps weren't at the front of our thinking, and I'm sure it will be now.
G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here with yet another update on the missing Malaysian Aero Celeste, or Mary Celeste of the skies as I'm beginning to think about it. Okay, so the aviation security industry's got a few issues that they'd like to sort out, and I think one of them might be the issue that emerged yesterday, which was that the government of Thailand announced that they had picked up radar indications of the aircraft making a turn away from its planned course within minutes of its transponder having been switched off, but they didn't mention this to anybody while everyone was searching in the South China Sea because nobody had asked them. Well, I guess you'd have to expect that countries which share a land border and have separate governments and separate militaries, they might be a little bit reticent about sharing information. But yesterday there were also a few really interesting stories. One of the most strange being the idea that 13 people in the Maldives between India and Africa claim to have seen a twin-engine wide-body passenger jet that looked a bit like an Airbus, and they saw it 250 feet off the ocean heading west in the direction of Africa, and they saw it on the Saturday afternoon. Now I don't believe there was enough fuel in the tanks to have taken off from Kuala Lumpur, headed 1 hour out in the general direction of Beijing, diverted 90 degrees or so to the west, flown across the Malaysian peninsula, given engine tweets coming 1 hour apart either from the northwest course or the southwest course, cutting out 6 or 7 hours after takeoff, with the final 2 tweets from the engines coming from the same location, and the aircraft then being spotted over the Maldives. The only way for that to have occurred is if the aircraft landed in India and was refuelled. You note that from India we now have a whole new lot of range lines, and whereas at the extreme, say 12-hour limit of the fuel, if it had stayed at cruising altitude, it could have reached southern Yemen, Oman, United Arab Emirates, Iran, Afghanistan or Pakistan. Alright, that's this red extreme range line. If we allow for a refuelling on the Indian coast, then my trusty rusty Air Ministry Wind and Navigation Calculator Mark 1 with isothermal calibration, reference number 6B/243, it tells me, or at least it does tell me, when I set up a pair of dividers with 1 hour's flight time on the scale of a pocket atlas map of the world, it tells me that it could have also gone to Turkey, Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, Kenya, Rwanda, Burundi, Tanzania, Madagascar even, as well as the Somali Republic. Okay, so that's the limit of the hijack theories, unless somebody wants to postulate a Burmese or Thai or Bangladeshi or Vietnamese or Laotian warlord who's somehow diverted the aircraft up into there. But personally, my explanation for the observed behaviour of the aircraft, as in 1 hour after taking off, the aircraft ceased to emit transponder signals, ceased to emit other telemetry except from the engine pods, so there was no radio signals coming out of the fuselage, but the engine pods were able to send. It ceased VHF voice radio signals. The tyres said that it turned at least 90 degrees. And whereas it was cruising at 35,000 feet, by the time it reached the Malaysian peninsula, it was down to 2,500 feet, having undulated between 35,000 feet and 5,000 feet and back up to 45,000 feet, 10,000 feet above cruise altitude, down to 2,500 feet crossing the peninsula, losing altitude, going out over the Andaman Sea, and then continuing to tweet via the engines for 7 hours, with the final 2 hourly tweets being in the same location. Okay? And my strong suspicion is that what would account for that is a meteor strike on the cockpit roof or the co-pilot's window, damaging the autopilot, damaging the radio, killing the crew, rendering everybody in the cabin unconscious from explosive decompression, knocking the nose down, knocking the aircraft 90 degrees off course, whereupon the dihedral of the wings will tend to level the aircraft in roll. The rudder will hold it stable in yaw, except when turbulence knocks it off course and changes its heading, while the decollage between the main wing and the horizontal stabiliser sets up a stable, unstable dynamic instability, which would account for a descent from 35,000 feet to 5,000 feet, a climb back up to 45,000 feet, a dive back down to 2,500 feet, and then disappearing out to sea, wobbling in the general direction of India. And my suspicion is it's crashed. Because if it hasn't crashed there, and if the sightings out here were serious, then it must have been refuelled. And I think I'd still rather go with the Occam's razor version, which is pick the smallest, simplest single cause, and if there's a natural cause that could account for that, we'll go for it. And I say a micro-meteor strike on the co-pilot's window. That's what I think happened to it. However, the radio has yet to have its say.
MH370. A former head of security and emergency management at Qantas says he has no doubt that the international search teams will find the missing Malaysia Airlines plane, and that this case will lead to significant changes in aviation security well beyond Malaysia. Jeff Askew spent nearly 15 years as the Group General Manager for Security and Emergency Management at Qantas. He says governments, airlines and aviation security authorities around the world are focused on flight MH370. I spoke to Jeff Askew just before we came on air. Jeff Askew, the Malaysian Transport Minister, is appealing to the United States government to share data from its Pine Gap base here in Australia to help find this missing plane. Is the US facility here likely to have picked up critical information?
Eleanor, I'm unable to answer that, but I would imagine that the cooperation that's been shown by many governments, including the US, that if they have information that's available and will assist the Malaysian government, that they would make that available.
Well, the Malaysian government says it is now revealing information from its military use satellites, and it is calling on other governments to do the same, but there is a suggestion that not all information has been coming forward. Is it a major problem in searches like this that governments don't reveal information because of the sensitivities of admitting that they're spying on their neighbours?
I don't think it's so much a matter of spying. I think there's certainly sensitivities around sovereignty and government sharing with other governments, I guess, the results or capabilities of their military assets. But I think when you've got civil tragedies like this, that most governments will make available whatever information they have. But certainly there is a sensitivity around military intelligence and military information.
How difficult is it, given modern surveillance regimes, for a plane to avoid detection at least somewhere?
Well, obviously, the last 2 weeks have proven that it's probably more difficult than most people thought. I think that that's probably part of the frustration that we see on the news every day with some of the relatives and families, that governments and aviation and air traffic management would be able to identify an aircraft and find it at all times. Obviously, that's not the capability, but it's obviously will be one of the huge ramifications that results from this sad incident.
Do you expect that this incident will lead to changes in aviation security beyond Malaysia?
Oh, absolutely. I would imagine that at the moment that this particular incident is number one on most governments and certainly aviation regulators and aircraft manufacturers' agendas. And I think it has ramifications for governments, regulators, aircraft manufacturers, as well as, of course, airlines and the industry generally.
So what sort of things are they watching out for? What sort of ramifications do you expect?
Well, I guess a lot of it will be driven by what is found to be facts. But I would speculate to say that governments will certainly look at airspace management and surveillance capabilities, and then the broader protection of that, so passport controls and the like. I think intelligence sharing of passengers' information will be back in the spotlight. So far as regulators go and aircraft manufacturers, they'll look at live transmission of data from aircraft. I think passenger screening will be reviewed about behaviour analysis, if you like. There's been a move for some years now to try and look for bad people rather than bad things. For that to be successful, then governments have got to share information about their citizens, and there's obviously privacy issues associated with that. And airlines will look at how they manage potential insider threats. I'm not suggesting for one moment that any of the crew were involved here, but if it turns out that they are, then insider threats will be focused again. And, of course, the integrity of cargo manifests come under scrutiny as well.
So you sound like you're talking about really quite far-reaching change.
I think there will be. I think that the industry has understood some of the safety and security challenges that it's faced, but this incident alone has highlighted a number that, although had been recognised, perhaps weren't at the front of thinking, and I'm sure it will be now.
You say that it shouldn't be so easy for pilots to manually switch off the data transmission transponders. Why is that allowed now?
I think that's a safety issue. I think that they have the ability to close down a number of electrical circuits in case of fire, and that's obviously understandable. But I'm sure that this will cause a review of the ability for pilots, or anyone else for that matter, to interfere with surveillance and data transmission from aircraft.
Now, you say that some of the changes will depend on what we find out about what actually happened to this plane. Do you expect that we will find out in the end not only where the plane is, but what happened to it in its final flying hours?
I'm pretty confident we will. I mean, it did take 5 years for the black box on the Air France aircraft to be recovered. I think that with the international cooperation that's occurring at the moment, the aircraft at some stage will be located. At that time, then the evidence will present to the authorities exactly what happened.
So you're not in the camp that says we may never know?
No, I think that we will know. I think we will find this aircraft. I just think that we've got to be very careful that our speculation doesn't give those families and friends of the 239 people on board false hope.
Do you think that the Malaysian authorities have been more chaotic in handling this than necessary, or is it the nature of such situations?
Look, I think it is the nature. I watched the CEO on that first evening. He really was obviously under enormous stress himself. He tried to provide as much information as he could about the pilot, about the aircraft, and I think that was very good. He was getting what information he could out there. Obviously, since that time, the coordination of the search has been taken out of the airline's hands and the rest with government agencies over there. I'm sure they're doing their very best. There's a lot of goodwill between other governments providing support, but it is an enormously stressful time for all those involved. So I think we've got to have some sort of sympathy for those politicians and regulators and other officials in Malaysia as they try and deal with this.
Jeff Askew, thanks so much for joining us.
Eleanor, you're most welcome. Thank you.
And Jeff Askew is the former Head of Security and Emergency Management at Qantas.
Okay, well, it's not surprising that the ex-head of security at Qantas has automatically leapt on the idea of it being a hijack. But, well, what's the point of hijacking a wide-body jet and then flying it on a porpoising course down to 5,000 feet, up to 45,000 feet, down to 2,500 feet, out over the ocean in the middle of the night? What are you going to do with it once you've done that? Are you making a political point? I mean, the Malaysian government actually suggested that because the pilot was a supporter of Amrah Ibrahim, then therefore he must have hijacked the aeroplane to paint the government of Malaysia in a bad light when they couldn't find it. That's one of the more ridiculous hijacking scenarios that I've heard. There's another one which suggests that out of the 120 Chinese citizens on board, there were a team of information technology engineers from Huawei, and maybe the United States Pentagon was sending a message to China to stop hacking American computers by drone controlling the entire aeroplane out into the ocean and crashing it where the wreckage wouldn't be found, to make the Chinese think twice about hacking the sacred American computers. Well, I don't think the Pentagon is arrogant or hubristic enough to do that. I think the idea that the Malaysian aircraft has been hijacked by somebody who landed it at Diego Garcia, the American strategic Air Force base on what used to be a British island between India and Africa, I think that's equally fanciful, because if the Chinese thought that that was what happened, they'd probably start, I don't know, bombing Washington or maybe Taiwan. You know, that would really be the cat among the pigeons sort of a thing. The idea that somebody pinched the aeroplane so that they could then pack it with explosives and fly it into a building somewhere, if that was the plan, it would have happened yet. It would have happened already. Another theory which I entertained for a while was the idea that somebody wants to use it for an Entebbe-style commando raid, where a wide-body jet in repainted colours shows up somewhere in the world, gives a convincing story over the radio as to who it's supposed to be, lands on the runway, taxis up to the terminal and disgorges a couple of hundred commandos who shoot everything that moves for the next however long it takes to get rid of them all. A bunch of Pakistanis did it with a minivan in India, and a different bunch were running around in Africa in a motel, taking days to be blasted into submission, just to make a political point. I think in both cases they were Taliban or Al-Qaeda affiliated. But yeah, there is that possibility. However, I still reckon that if you add up all of the factoids and the pointers and the bits of evidence, the most reasonable, simplest solution is that the aircraft was out of control and it was some kind of impact damage which knocked out its autopilot and its transponder and its fuselage-based radio. And for my money, that means a micrometeorite coming in and smacking into about there. Because, according to my frontal lobes, applied to the parallel rule and the precision dividers via the wind and navigation computer Mark I with isothermal calibration, that covers all the evidence and it doesn't multiply entities. I think it crashed because of a micrometeor. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Time will tell. Ciao.